All right, so without further ado, we're going to get started with our first panel, and that panel is on methodologies for transregionalism. And to lead us in the discussion is none other than Dr. Tatiana Carayannis of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University. Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Leland, and thanks to all the colleagues who have joined us for this year's forum. As Leland mentioned, this year's theme, the theme of the forum is transregionalism, where we seek to develop new frameworks and methodologies on how to study China's engagement across regions. Now, let me begin just by saying, before I introduce our three panelists, in the 1950s through the 70s, amid the breakup of colonial empires and the emergence of newly independent states, a group of actors recognized a need to develop new research capacity in American universities on distant parts of the globe. In this context, these actors cultivated a new research field that we called area studies, with the intent to build research and teaching capacities on these regions of the world. But since then, we've had a lot of debates questioning the very idea of area studies. How do we conceptualize and define a region? What constitutes a regional approach, let alone a trans-regional approach, in an increasingly mobile, globalized, and unbounded world? Is the region determined by physical or geographic boundaries, or by cultural or socioeconomic boundaries? What of diasporas? Regional approaches have often been based on the nation state, but regions and boundaries are themselves social constructs. There's also the space versus place debates, and those depend on discipline. So increasingly, we have terms like global Africa or global Asia or China, Latin America, or Inter-Asia. So are we thinking about the transregional as in comparative studies, or transregional as in the movement or relationship between two regions? Should the delineation of a region be locally determined according to the lived realities and identities of the people in that region? Or should it be determined by discipline? For example, a historical approach might differ from an economic one or an archaeological one. So, in other words, how we define a region might be relational. How do we approach transregional work without falling back on the old area studies paradigms? And how do we strengthen the ways in which we attend to context? So these are some of the questions that we hope to address in this plenary panel before we break into our breakout groups. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes. I will be pretty ruthless with that, so that then we'll open to discussion and we'll have sufficient time for discussion. We'll begin with our colleague Bob Wekesa, then move on to Dr. Pavithra Jayawardena, and then we'll hear from Dr. Mengshu Zhan. Bob Wekesa, you've just heard from him, is the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University in South Africa. He's the interim coordinator of the Africa-US Universities Network. He teaches and supervises international media and communications projects focusing on Africa, China, and Africa, United States topics. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Nairobi and a master's and a PhD from the Communication University of China. He's been involved in transregional research and engagement over the last 5 years, and I consider him a friend. So, Bob, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Thank you very much, Tatiana. And I must start by saying that we could even end the discussion with just your framing of this session, because you really touched on the key areas of contestation, of discussion, and so forth. But suffice it to say that indeed one of our starting point is to look at the distinctions between the terms themselves, because I think the terms and the words we use proffer very serious meaning that then directs us in terms of where we go. How do we approach as the study of transregionalism, for example? And I think you already touched on the distinctions between notions of transnationalism and transnationalism and transregionalism. And one could actually add cross-regionalism, cross-nationalism. In my thinking, understanding these terms and distinguishing them, and I think not much work has really been done in this area, can then help us understand, for example, the relations between the Africa, the Americas, and China. And I think one of the starting ways of, one of the pathways of looking at this question is to consider transnationalism as relations between states, sovereign states as it were, such that, for example, in the African context, we will consider the regions, the 5 regions of the continent. This will be the East African Community, the South African Development Community, ECAS, which is the Economic Community of Central African States, ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, AMU, which is Arab Maghreb Union. I know sometimes we think of sub-Saharan Africa and leave out Northern Africa. And between these countries, you have what we may call transnationalism, because Uganda and Kenya relate on the basis of transnational engagements. South Africa and Lesotho and Eswatini relate on the same basis. Gabon, Democratic Republic of Congo, Republic of Congo, which is called Congo Brazzaville, Ghana, Benin, and so forth. Those engagements are closer geographically. The cultural affinities also follow very closely and so forth. But then this then can be distinguished from, say, cross-regionalism, which will be, for example, relations between, in fact, Africa and China, or Africa and the Americas. If we consider China a region, then it crosses, it intersects with Africa, even though as nation states, they don't have shared geographical borders. Neither are the cultural nuances that very close, although there's always, we can always talk of humanity being one, and so forth. So in my sense, transregionalism actually offers us a framework for looking at relations that are neither just between 2 specific regions that have come together, for example, signed a treaty or negotiated some formal arrangement, or nations that share borders and sometimes fight, sometimes agree, and so forth. I think that would be my starting point. My second point would be to look at the issue that Tatiana touched on, which is area studies. I think area studies continue in some guise, in some form or shape, even today, even though they have been critiqued for years, and I'm of a like opinion that I think area studies have to be rethought and almost go as far as suggest that we have to start abandoning the idea of area studies as initially envisaged, because it suggests that scholars or countries or universities or institutions actually come to a region and study it as a bound region. And yet, the notions of, say, globalization and the transregional issues that we're discussing mean that we have already gone beyond that. I'm just thinking, for example, if you're studying diaspora and you think of Africans who live in Brazil, who are immigrants in Brazil, as an example, among others, they circulate between the African continent, or whatever country they come from, and Brazil quite a bit. So you are not going to actually be able to effectively pinpoint where they belong. They are global citizens. And therefore the notion of, say, for example, global Africa. So you are on slippery territory if you are going to insist that we want to study Kenya or Egypt or Democratic Republic of Congo as one nation. trade and cultural and security and other kinds of sensibilities have shifted so much that that's no longer possible. I think this is one more reason why we need to push the envelope as far as transregionalism is concerned. I think I'll then come to my third point, which is around creating frameworks through which we can understand how transregionalism proceeds. And one way of looking at it is vertical transregionalism. This is like transregionalism from above. Globalization is, again, a good notion, particularly from my field of media and communication. When you look at information and communication flows, and one will go on and talk about cultural flows. We remember the UNESCO debates of 1970s and 80s about the New World Information and Communication Order, which some people are actually thinking of reviving. It suggests that transregionalism is unequal, it has hierarchies, and therefore the less endowed countries are on the receiving end of international public goods. And I think now one then compares that to horizontal, transregionalism, which is much more natural. If anyone was in the city of Nairobi, for example, and went out for a drink, to unwind, you are likely to meet Pakistanis, Indians, Americans, and so forth. So this phenomenon at the horizontal level, at almost the people-to-people level, is already happening. And as scholars will just have to undertake, field studies, comparative studies to unlock, to provide that information after the fact. And lastly, we could actually look at transregionalism from the point of view of agency. And I know that this word agency has been bandied around quite a bit, particularly when you think of African agency. And I'm sure Latin American agency. Agency then will suggest that where there are shortfalls in terms of Africa's, Latin America's engagement with a country, with a global power, such as China, that then we look at how do we negotiate better engagement terms? How do we do correct issues like unequal trade terms and so forth? And this then can feed into intellectual work in terms of looking at how academic work can lead to better policies at the government level. And I think I'll stop there because I believe I'm almost run short of my time already. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. These are excellent points that we'll come back to in the discussion. Now, let me introduce Dr. Pavithra Jayawardena, who's a senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations, the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. She completed her PhD in political science at the Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Her master's and bachelor's degrees are in international relations from the University of Colombo. She was a SUSI 2024 scholar, study in U.S. institutes on U.S. foreign policy, and completed her program at the University of Delaware in the U.S. Her specific research areas are geopolitics, migration, transnationalism, and citizenship. And she's the author of Immigrant Citizenship Perceptions, Sri Lankans in Australia and New Zealand, published by Peter Lang last year. Pavithra, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. So good morning to all of you. It's late evening in Sri Lanka. I'm connecting from Sri Lanka. And I'm very glad to be here with all of you and looking ahead for the day. And I would like to share some observations that I have made in terms of how we, the world in general, see China. And I spent, as Tatiana said, nearly 2 months in the States in June and July this year, participating in a program called SUSI on US foreign policy. And we were very closely interacting with various academicians, policymakers and think tanks who shape, impact, and actually formulate strategies and policies, both American and sometimes global, specifically towards China. Well, I understand that 2 months is not enough at all to make sound conclusions, but let us also not undervalue the fresh eye that I had as a Global South researcher to evaluate the Global North's dominant ideas towards world power, especially concerning China's role in the global affairs. So the big question behind most of the conversations we had was, can China be the next global power? What are China's chances? I observed two key arguments. One argument believed that China can become the global power, and because of its impressive economic and trade capabilities. And one sub-argument is that even if China becomes the global power, the global order, the multilateral system will not be changed, because for China, it's still profitable to adapt to the multilateral system than changing it. So there won't be much difference in terms of the world order. The other idea, which I thought is the most dominant among actually those who have the power to shape the policy and perception about China, is the idea that China will not easily be the global power. The idea is that it is true China has enormous economic strength, but it has not developed a strong military presence across the world. So it's not equivalent or even close to US's power. So it's highly unlikely that China replaces the US as the global power. And I'm mostly interested in stretching this argument with my global South and especially South Asian experience, and also with my conversations with various other early and mid-career IR scholars from Latin America, Pacific Islands, Africa and Asia, and also Europe, about the similar trends and patterns of China and its engagements with their respective countries. It appeared to me that if we closely observe how China is engaging with our societies from a trans-regional point of view, and how, if China is transforming us, it has many similarities at its core. But we tend to not see the actual level of this transformation that is happening in the world's peripheries due to two reasons. One is because we lack a trans-regional knowledge on China's engagements in global affairs, a comparative knowledge, specifically on the peripheral regions. I'm acknowledging the prejudice of the word, I'm using it. The peripheral regions, the Asia, the Africa, and Latin America. The second is the traditional mindset that we have about power, the idea that traditional military presence as the most impactful power that can change the world affairs. It is true that in academic literature, we talk about the concepts and the power of non-traditional security and human security, yet in the policy making and strategy formulation, a disproportionate emphasis is still given to the traditional military idea. I want to make the point that it is worth to consider that because of these two reasons, perhaps we have not yet captured China well and China's quest for power and its means. If we really want to understand China and whether its involvements in the peripheral regions has the ability to make it a global power, it suggests that we should epistemologically go beyond the economic and military lens through which we are trained to look at them. We should pay detailed attention to the domestic experiences of countries as at the individual level, but also the regional experiences and trans-regional experiences, and use comparative lenses to see whether there are common trends and patterns. Based on our discussions with the fellow early and mid-career academics from Latin America, Pacific Islands, Africa, and Asia, we noticed one common reason for most of our countries to start and continue relations with China. That is, that there is a strong sense of ignorance that they feel from Western powers, let it be Venezuela or Malawi or Papua New Guinea or Sri Lanka. In terms of the economic difficulties, security matters, and democracy, there's a sense that the Western powers are ignoring these countries. There is a considerable trust deficit and pressure as well And this opens a vacuum to be filled by another power, in this case, China. The rulers of most of these countries also face a lot of domestic pressure, which leaves them with no other option but agreeing to the utilitarian benefits China is promising to grant. Another observation is that through China's engagements with these countries, projects, engagements, and various loans, some deep transformations are taking place in the host societies, which we have not given enough attention to. The reason for low attention to these is because these changes seem to be trivial, country-specific, and accidental. But a trans-regional analysis will tell us that if you find methods to pool these similarities together, the level of impact it does to the world quest could be massive. Let me lay out a very few basic examples that I would like that I noticed as important experiences from
Pavithra, can you try to wrap up?
Sorry, Tatiana, it's
try
7
to-
minutes, I can see.
Yeah, okay. Keep going, but just try to wrap up in the next few minutes.
Oh,
All right,
yeah,
go ahead.
sure, sure. I have 3 more minutes, right? I'll wrap up in 3 minutes. Thank you. So the Confucius Centers. Confucius Centers tell us where China is in our academia. Confucius Centers are increasingly changing the academic culture of the host societies. They are more proactively engaging in faculties, making long-term dependencies. Last year in Sri Lanka, at a state university in an inaugural session of a respective conference, China's national anthem was sung without the knowledge of even the chair of the conference. They spent a lot of money, and they also enter to the academic sovereignty space in a way that it makes long-lasting impacts. Most of the scholarships, exchanges, and funding we receive are from China, and it's a common experience. Chinese workers tell us where China is in our society. An African scholar from Malawi took seriously the matter of Chinese workers who are in his country, starting relationships with African women and leaving them with their kids. He felt that this could even be an organized strategy of the state of China. Although in our region, in the sense South Asia, we don't see this trend as a significant one. You see, Chinese people are encouraged by the state to reside in the host country and engage more proactively with the host affairs. Let us also now see where China is in our jurisdiction. You might have heard China's port city project, which is still being constructed, and it is still not clear which jurisdiction it will be used to govern it. Whether it's the Sri Lankan law, Chinese law, or a specific commercial law for the land. Although port city is not a military base, this risk of being governed by a different law will bring considerable implications of Sri Lanka. Where is China in a connectivity language? I find it interesting to observe how China gets its agents to learn local languages to facilitate their engagements with the locals. Previously, if we, the people in peripheries, needed to engage with the superpowers, be it the Britain, the US, or Spain, we had to learn their language. But China learns our language, and they come to us, which is a different approach from a superpower than we had ever seen. So these examples may look too micro, too trivial, and unintentional, but what if they are not? We could only know if we look at these details through a comparative lens, a cross-regional and trans-regional view. And I suggest going back to basics, talking with each other, discussions, chats, and idea sharing among academics in these countries. In conclusion, I suggest that if we seriously want to understand China, we need to go beyond the state-centric, traditional security-based knowledge and top-down approach. We need to adopt a trans-regional approach and look closely on what is happening specifically in the peripheral countries and societies. I suggest that if we start doing it, we might be able to see the common trends and patterns of China's power expansion in a fresh eye. My trans-regional hypothesis is that China has started the transformation, but they have started it in the peripheries first, and it will reach the core slowly but surely. You will only identify it through closely observing the peripheral experiences through a transregional approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pavithra. That was really excellent and a lot of food for thought and for discussion. Let me now hand it over to our third and last speaker before we open it up to discussion, Dr. Mengshu Zhan, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for African Studies at Howard, Center of African Studies at Howard University. She holds a PhD from the Center for Global Studies at Bonn University in Germany. And her research interests include China-Africa relations, EU-China-Africa trilateral relations, with a focus on the economy, infrastructure, and energy. And she's now a visiting researcher at Howard University. Mengshu, Dr. Zhan, over to you.
Yes, hello everyone. Can I use the PowerPoint?
Sure, go ahead. If
So I
whoever's
just
running,
share my screen.
Yeah. Let's make
Okay.
sure that Dr. Zhan can share her screen.
You should have the ability now.
Oh, okay.
Are you unable to share your screen?
Yeah. I'm trying. I can't find. Oh yes, this one. Yeah. Okay.
There we go.
How can I get started?
Well, I don't read Mandarin.
It's
Leland?
Mandarin?
Well, I don't know. Yes, it is. So I can't see. Not entirely sure how.
Oh, so you control the screen?
No, you control the screen.
Yeah,
Here we
okay.
go.
So, yeah, thank you very much. And it's an honor to have the presentation here. And I will talk about the Chinese scholars' perceptions about the China's engagement across different regions. So then we can understand better how the Chinese scholars and the Chinese government thinking about this issue. So I use the realism and the discourse analysis to do this research. So I selected the Chinese scholars' opinion from their published articles and to evaluate the China is a defensive realist or offensive realist. And first of all, I will talk about the prediction about the world order from Chinese scholars. Most of Chinese scholars support the multipolarization, and this also Chinese government thinking. So majority of Chinese scholars also support the government thinking. But there are also majority view among the Chinese scholars to support the bipolarization, like the bipolar partners of the world with the US and China. But the Chinese scholars believe their own won't completely break off the diplomatic relations between the two superpower, and they won't believe the Cold War will come back again. And then I will talk about the relations with the U.S. From Chinese scholars' perception. First point, they believe the Taiwan issue and Russia and Ukraine war have intensified the Sino-US conflicts, and the competition will be more heated, but they think both the great powers can still coexistent. So and they still think that China have not enough strength to compete with the US, especially in the economic, military, and soft power. And also, the US have a strong alliance, but China have no this kind of alliance, like compare with the US. And then the relations with the US, the EU, Chinese scholars believe that the EU plays a very important role between China and the US relations. But due to also the Russia and Ukraine war, this relation also have some conflict, especially in the politics. So its relation shows that the coldness in politics, but the economic partnership between those two powers still quite hot. These two continue to do the bilateral trade a lot. So Chinese scholars believe the competition between China and the EU is increasing, but cooperation is still more than the competition. And now it's the relation with Russia. After the Russia and Ukraine war, there are two groups in Chinese scholars. One group support Russia, so it's also the viewpoint with the Chinese government. So also majority of Chinese scholars support the Chinese government to maintain close cooperation with Russia and support Russia, and maybe in the future even become alliance with Russia. But also there are some other Chinese scholars, they against Russia. So because they think like the goals of the two superpower in the international strategy is also already have a huge differences because China still want to maintain the current world order, but Russia would like to reshape the current world order. So they already have the differences in terms. And because of the Ukraine war, the China also got huge economic losses because the EU and the US also did some sanction against China, and it also harmed a lot the trade between China and the EU. So the two groups discussed a lot, and they have heated debate in China. And also the relations with the global South countries. Chinese government and also Chinese scholars to support to maintain close ties with the global South countries, and because China needs the political support, also the economic market in those countries. But some Chinese scholars they recognize the rising of global South countries, that they adopt that global South countries has the certain ability to become a new polar in the world order in the future. So they still think the global South countries is compared to the Western countries too a little bit vague. So also the Chinese scholars also think it is hard to become a strong partner with the global South countries. So in the conclusion, we can see the Chinese scholars' opinion shows that China try the best to avoiding the conflicts with the other great powers and emphasizing cooperation with those countries. So, and they also believe that China is not strong enough to compete with the US and shake the dominant position of US in the world. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mengshu, for those important points that I think complement Pavithra's comment as well. We have about 25 minutes for discussion, questions, comments from the audience. Please feel free to make comments and address some of what was said here, or some of the framing of this session. Just go down to the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, and raise your little yellow hand, and hopefully I will be able to see it. While we wait for folks to get warmed up, let me ask a couple of questions. First, one on pedagogy, and particularly to Bob and Pavithra. Also, Mengshu, if you'd like to come in on this. How do we train the next generation of graduate students to do transregional research? Or how do we do it? What tools are necessary? Do we still need context or region-specific knowledge or language? So there are some, for example, Jamie Monson at Michigan State University, who has done some work in trying to advance transregional studies. This suggests that we still need to have a strong foundation in area studies. So we still need to be Latin Americanists, or we still need to be Africanists, to use the area studies frames, and then be able to study whether it's China or so what are the pedagogical needs and challenges? And Mengshu, well, we've seen the questioning of area studies in the US over the last few decades. The aim to systematically develop area studies is finding new purchase in China, as Chinese engagement in Africa and Latin America has expanded and deepened. Is there a deliberate research strategy to project power across the global South or the global majority first. And as Pavithra, you noted that this is actually a different model of power projection that we're seeing from China to actually start with the, as you put it, the periphery or the global majority. So maybe I can invite the three of you to comment on this, and maybe we'll go in the order in which we started with Bob first.
Thank you, Tatiana. This is a naughty question. It's not one that you can unbundle quickly. But suffice it to say, I will agree with our senior colleague, Jamie Monsoon, that you need indeed country or region-specific expertise and depth of knowledge if you're going to make sense transregionally. But having said that, I think the challenge with area studies is being stuck with expertise in one area more than the other. So I suppose one of the questions that we'll have to grapple with at the pedagogy level, which is linked to research and even engagement across the regions, is to pose the question, what constitutes trans-regional research, trans-regional teaching, trans-regional engagement? And I'll reverse that to say, what is not trans-regionalism? Because I think if you think of in reverse, it helps you to kind of understand the missing links. And for me, just 2 points. It is not trans-regional research or studies for that matter if the concepts and theories that are used are developed in one region, are not contextualized in another region. I'll give you an example. On the African continent, the theories that we are pretty much using in class and research and which feature in some form or shape in intellectual work include Afrocentrism, the communitarian theories of Ubuntuism, Nabudere's notion of Africology, their notions of Afropolitanism. And, when you look at research that emanates from other regions, you do not see this. In fact, decolonization as one of the key theories that has emerged, particularly from South Africa, but spreading elsewhere. So at the level of knowledge production, we already see the contesting received wisdom, which is usually from the global north and increasingly from China itself. I think we all know of China's community of shared humanity as a philosophical and theoretical entry into discussions with other regions. So I think that would be one point of view. The other one is to actually understand at a very fundamental level that you're not going to study China in Africa without the US featuring, for example. This is the reality. And for those of us who are researchers, who are journalists, who are commentators, we know, for example, when you think of Tazara, let me give you the example of Tazara, the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. Quickly, we're now hearing of the Lobito Corridor, the infrastructure that is being built from Angola through the Democratic Republic of Congo to Zambia. So there and then you are looking at China and the US figures in the picture. So it will then therefore suggest that if you are looking at, say, infrastructure development with the cultural, informational, historical nuances that come with it, you have no choice but to have expertise in both China and the US. And I think this is reflected in the fact of our center, the African Center for the Study of the US. Half the time we've tried to say we are studying the US, not China. But suddenly you have a digital competition, you have AI, and it is China versus the US and so forth. So I think it's not going to be possible to just focus on one region as an area of expertise, meaning that research therefore has to take account of the fact of the entangled intersections of all these players. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That relates very much, I think, to Pavithra, your point that you can't understand China without looking at China's role across the global majority, not just in one region. And you've made the case for advancing, as you said, a transregional perspective on China's engagement in the world to understand how China is projecting power in one region or another. Let me hand it to you, and I have, thank you, noted the question for, there's a question for you, Bob, in the chat. If there are other questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand, and hopefully we'll be able to do another round. Pavithra, please.
Yes, I'll be very brief. I must confess that where I'm coming from in Sri Lanka, IR education and the scopes and the curriculums are still very mainstream and top down, and so it's very slow to propose different pedagogies, etc., etc. So what we see is in the undergraduate level, in the postgraduate level, we are kind of reproducing the mainstream IR knowledge, which is very state-centric and military or security-centric. What I try to do in my classrooms is, and I'm coming also from a very different region, South Asia, we are very fragmented as a region. We do not have a regional identity per se, you know, even in the area studies, for that matter, you know, but then because of the ideas in the regionalism or regional integration, all these, you know, categories that we are borrowing from, we are in a very strange situation to really understand the reality and the impositions. So what I try to do in my classrooms pedagogically is to take cases and kind of unpack those cases and identify the stakeholders and the processes through which these events or incidents are taking place. And having said that, I'm just trying it with my undergraduates because it's very difficult, even in a situation where even to make sense the basic stuff in the world affairs, you need to borrow from what is existing. And then, as you said, probably to go for the transregional level, you must first have the area studies knowledge, and then, but then in a situation where you don't even have the area studies ideas, in a way it's an opportunity, but on the other hand, you lack the vocabulary, you lack the ideas, you lack proper methodologies. So it's in a very, I would say, a strange position, but I also see the opportunities there. What I try to do is to ask the students to look at the world without a specific purpose, without the burden of proposing policies, proposing strategies, etc., in a very inductive way. Because what I see in the IR landscape is that we often we are kind of burdened with proposing what to be done, you know, the strategies and policies, etc., etc. And when you have that kind of a purpose, you tend to think in a certain way. So what inductive versus deductive. So I'm trying to sort of get the students to think about things without a final tangible output, which gives them freedom and liberty to interpret things as they want. But I think we are very behind of that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Mengshu? You're muted, Mengshu.
Sorry. I think about the region across region studies. I think the most important is like the research institute and the universities should promote more exchange projects for the students, because when I in African and even my colleagues studied China-African relations, they haven't been to China and they don't have a chance to go to China. So I think they can't understand good about the Chinese cultural background and the Chinese how the Chinese really thinking. So I think even now we have high technology to translate the documents, but I think it's important to in person to go to that region and area to experience the real culture and to learn the language, and it's better to improve the research and the studies of the students.
Thanks, Mengshu. That's great. And Bob, as I said, there's a question in the chat for you. I'll come back to you in a minute. I wanted to bring in Parsifal. Parsifal, if you can identify yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, thank you, Tatiana, and thank you all the panelists. Fascinating conversation. My name is Parsifal de Sola. I'm the head of the China Latin America Research Center of the Andrés Bello Foundation, based in Bogota, Colombia. More than a question, it's a comment, food for thought, and maybe some of the panelists can comment on it. So traditionally, area studies have been the predominantly proposed and researched in global powers, or at least countries with global ambitions throughout the last 100 years. It's very rare, at least in Latin America, there are very few universities that actually have, let's say, US studies or European studies, again, taking a whole region, much less Africa studies, Asia, Southeast Asia, or Middle Eastern studies. So this has been mostly something that has been focused or concentrated in universities of the global north. And China coming into this, it's a new player, at least in this field, which I think it's evidence of of China wanting to be part of that, a conversation within academia and creating, regional studies. And we're not going to enter into the reasons why this is, but I think a huge part of it would be lack of interest on one side and lack of funding on the other. This is a huge problem, as Mengshu was mentioning, having exchange programs. These kind of exchange programs, they're extremely limited. And nowadays, you do have some very, counted options coming from Europe and the US, but you have tons coming out of China. And that is something that it will eventually have an impact on studies. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there as a comment.
Thank you, Parsifal. I think that's very, very useful. And in fact, I ran a project up until last year on China and the Global South. And one of the key findings was that, when funding dries up in whether it's in Africa or in Latin America and the Caribbean, the capacity to understand China, to do research on China's engagement with that region dries up. So one of the questions that we had been grappling with is how do you make that knowledge sustainable? So Let me, I think, Krista Johnson, did you have your hand up and then it went down?
Yes, I'm sorry, that was a mistake. I thought I had my hand up. I'm sorry. I don't have a
Yeah.
question at this time. Thank you.
You do or you don't?
I
Okay.
do not. I'm
Okay,
sorry. Thank
got
you.
it. No, that's quite all right. So let me bring it back to Bob to respond to the question in the chat.
Thank you, Tatiana. And I think this is an interesting question because it strikes at an issue that has been a subject of a lot of pontification for years. And the question has always been, should we look at China's engagement with Africa as an entire region, say through the African Union, or should we focus? In fact, it's been approached from the question of agency. Should agency start at the continental level, at the regional economic level, or at the national level? And many colleagues, quite a good number of colleagues have argued that it should emerge, Africa's agency towards China should emerge at all these three levels, and that one does not cancel the other. In this particular question, I think colleague Jelin is asking the comparison between ECOWAS and SADC. And I think one can take the monolithic view that indeed we can look at these regions as being approached and also approaching China in many ways that are similar. But at the same time, there are differences. And these differences then nuance the trans-regional kind of comparative analysis where you look at similarities and differences. And one will actually see that and I think now I'm hazarding some guesses here. I haven't done this comparative study, but a trans-regional project, in my opinion, could start with the fact that the SADC region seems more homogeneous than ECOWAS from the point of culture, languages, from the point of historical developments. Many of the SADC countries achieved their independence much later compared to the ECOWAS region. I think one will have to throw in the fact that SANS, Angola, and Mozambique, all these countries are Anglophone or English-speaking countries, whereas in West Africa, you have largely Francophone-speaking countries, even though Nigerians will tell you that with a population of over 200, we kind of more than make up for that. But then you also throw in Ghana and Sierra Leone and Liberia and so forth. So in fact, the involvement of France in ECOWAS is an issue or factor that a national study will have to consider. And I think a good example of China's involvement in this region that is worth studying is the fact that riding on the political and ideological affinities from the 60s and the 1970s, only recently, the People's Republic of China has opened the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Leadership School, which some people have called an ideology school. And my colleague Paul Nantulia is even more well-versed, is on the call here. So you can see that we don't have a similar, kind of university kind of setting, if you want, that the PRC has used in SADC, compared to ECOWAS. So I think in a nutshell, a comparative transregional project, a research project, will have to look at similarities because China said it wants to engage across the continent, but then there are nuances that make specific regions and the nations within those regions kind of unique. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks to all three of our panelists. My main takeaways from this panel are one that I think most of you agree that we still need area specializations in our work, but that we also need more comparative work to better understand China's engagement, to better identify trends and patterns, and that leads me to perhaps suggest the need for more collaborations, because it's impossible for any one of us to understand the whole elephant, so to speak. So it's going back to the parable of the six blind men and the elephant. Each one of us can see one part of the elephant, but perhaps not the whole. With that, thank you for kicking us off. And these are good issues to keep in mind as we do our deep dives into the various thematic topics that we're now going to dive into. Leland, let me hand it back over to you.
Tatiana, thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists for starting off with this excellent discussion on frameworks for transregionalism.